Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the panel on shaping LTS together, what we've learned the hard way. I'm generally excited about this conversation because the timing couldn't be more interesting. As some of you may know, so the Kubernetes LTS working group has proposed to wind down. So this is an interesting time to have this conversation and have this panel in the first place. But even though the working group has decided to wrap up, the problems that it's trying to solve isn't going away, right? So I think it's timely that we talk about it, and who better to talk about it than the people who are actually doing this in the real world. Just a quick note about that, though. So we're not going to be comparing vendors or declaring that this is the best model to do LTS. This is more about just sharing the common challenges, patterns that we've seen while doing LTS in our respective companies or just in the community, and what can we take away from it in the ecosystem. So with that, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and maybe I'll go first, just since I'm speaking. So my name is Nikhita. I'll be the moderator for this session. I am an engineering manager at Broadcom, and I do all things Kubernetes.
And I'm Micah Hausler. I am a principal engineer at AWS. I work on Kubernetes and EKS, primarily on security, but also have quite a bit of overlap with LTS. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the LTS working group.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nikhila. I'm a product manager at Broadcom, mainly focused on Kubernetes and LTS being one of the main focus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aniket Ponkshe. I'm at Canonical Ubuntu. I've had the privilege to run our partnership with many different companies, including VMware. In my past, I've run NVIDIA and other relationships. Happy to be here. Excited about this chat.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Jeremy Rickard. I am a principal engineer at Microsoft, and I lead a team that's responsible for building artifacts that are going to get consumed inside of Azure services like AKS. Specifically around Kubernetes. I'm also a co-chair of Working Group LTS and a co-chair of SIG Release.
Thanks, everyone. So let's kick it off. So let's start with really understanding why LTS, right? Like what's really driving this conversation in the industry, and why should we care about it? Anyone wants to go first?
Okay, I can go first. So in my view, some of the forces are industries where end-to-end validation, which is typically a very lengthy process. By the time these customers go into production, most of the support is already lost from the standard support. And we also have regulated customers who are running mission-critical workloads, and they prefer a more conservative approach where they prefer longer upgrade cycles and making very gradual updates to the fleet because they only get very limited maintenance windows, and they're very careful as they're accountable for any outages, as an example, right? So I think, at least in these two aspects, I feel they are the main driving forces.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I've seen a lot in talking to customers and the community as well. I think one other that I'd add to that is so much of what we do is working with connected systems where, okay, you can just update the bits, right? Like, why don't you just do that? In some of these cases, they're not connected systems, and they might be systems that get deployed to places where they're not internet connected, and so they want customers might want something to run for a very long time. They might get offline updates or something, and so they can do a periodic update, but they still have these regulatory compliance needs. So that's one other case that I would add.
I think another factor that comes into this for some sets of users is remembering the past. And there were certain periods of time where upgrading Kubernetes was extremely difficult. Certain APIs might have gone away, or there were significant changes that were really hard to react to, especially if you built custom solutions on top of Kubernetes. And I think a lot of that has gotten better, but people still have a long memory of dealing with some of those things.
Yeah, it's the, I think Nikhila touched upon the kind of legal compliance reasons why you want to stay on something. Some of the certifications take actually longer than what Kubernetes runs for today. So you couldn't possibly deploy in a FedGov scenario with that sort of story. I think I relate that to the app ecosystem because you have a bunch of things that depend on that Kubernetes, and now all of it has to move along. So people want to keep something, and then yes, new stuff can be on newer releases and so on, but the API compatibility and such doesn't always support that. I think those two are the key reasons, and there's a cost factor that drives enterprises, which there's the cloud, and there's sort of a move to sovereign AI, kind of on-prem deployments where the persona of who's deploying something is a little different. And they have a more traditional viewpoint where they have been upgrading their infrastructure at a certain cadence, and they're not used to the fast-paced of story. So we see that need in telco, in some other verticals like the federal government.
While we've talked about a lot of regulatory industries, I think, Jeremy, you brought up that I think most folks have this trauma of upgrades. This is something that comes up during the LTS discussions, is if we invest more in making upgrades easier, do we not need LTS anymore?
I think that's a question that has a lot of answers, and it's really going to depend on the situation, right? Those highly regulated industries, that's not going to solve the problem because you're still going to have to go through these long periods of time. I think there is significant work to make the upgrade experience better happening now. There's a CAP that is alpha, I think, right now, that enables compatibility versions on the API. So you can do a binary upgrade, but set the API compatibility back and then test things out and have a better understanding of how some of that works. But I don't think you'll ever solve the problem for everybody, especially if you're running your own Kubernetes, especially if you're running on bare metal. If there's all kinds of constraints that can come into the equation.
That makes sense. So since we're talking about LTS, let's talk about the long-term aspect of it. So what does extended support really mean? So I know there's no single right answer to this, but what factors influence the timeline that should be chosen?
I think that one of the things that we found is that it's largely just influenced by customers. Like they will sort of dictate, like we're humans, we live on a planet Earth that has 4 seasons and a yearly cycle, and so we like to think about that. And so Kubernetes itself has 12 plus 2 months, so a 14-month period, and even our own product at Amazon, we had another 12 months on that. It's not necessarily a technical reason for that. I think it's more of a societal thing than anything. And that's sort of I don't think you're ever going to have a perfect answer for everyone, as we've already alluded to. You're always, no matter what term you pick, you're going to get people who want longer.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite books that I ever read to my children was If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. And it's all about the slippery slope of always wanting more and wanting more. And I think that's something we've seen from people. Well, you're doing 12 now, please do more. There's got to be a point where you draw a line. And I think maybe unsurprisingly, the major vendors have kind of aligned on a similar period. It's a balancing act. I think the complexity of maintaining those things over a long period of time goes up the longer you get away from that original point of origin. And
is there like an inflection point, like beyond this time it's going to get significantly harder?
Yeah. I think that's
Yeah, I think like customers expect a viable product, right? It's not the support just for the runtime. It's also the additional add-ons that you would have to deploy in order to actually make it a consumable platform. And just trying to synchronize between the individual add-on cadences with the Kubernetes runtime cadence I think it's one has always been a challenge. And also the sufficient overlap that they expect, because they're not going to upgrade that often compared to other customers. So these customers are looking for stability. So how much of an upgrade overlap can we give them?
Yeah. For us, it's self-sorting, right? There's people who want to keep moving at the 4-month cadence, and more power to them. There are genuine use cases where they want to deploy and forget, and they want the same kind of story that we give with Ubuntu to come to stuff higher up the stack. Of course, it's way more complicated because there's applications and all sorts of things, but really we try not to be judgmental about people's choices as to why they want to stay there. If they want to stay there, they probably have a good reason as to why they're staying there.
That's fair enough. Another interesting thing that comes in is how do you, what are the architectural decisions, let me put it this way, do you take into account when deciding which version should be extended support? And is it all versions? Is it few of them? And is it this release has less number of features, it's more bug fixes, and so on? What do you think about that?
I'll go first. I think we initially kind of centered on the idea that we would pick a release. That would be the long-term support release. But from an architectural standpoint, we don't run a single node OS. We run Ubuntu-based nodes. We also support Azure Linux-based nodes. We support Windows nodes. And the complexity of making sure that all of those things can align as well is just another piece of the matrix to think of. So if you're going to pick one and then 3 releases later, making sure that the upgrade path for all of those things is good is really complicated. So I think for us, it made more sense to do every release because it just simplified one of those extra pieces of the equation.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same way we landed as well at AWS, having every release be the same term of support. I think there's obviously a decision when you first implement something about which release do we like the best that we don't want to maintain, or is there a release we don't want to maintain that we want to start this with? But I think we found very similar results.
We also settled on the same thing. I think consistent pattern is what is more critical for LTS customers, and also just making it every minor just gives them the flexibility to adopt a feature when they are ready. Instead of waiting for another LTS version.
Yeah, maybe I'll be quite the devil's advocate, but taking a bit of a nuanced view. We did a big survey with one of the big cloud vendors as to what is the consumption pattern that people prefer when it comes to their stack, right? So it's right from the OS up to Kubernetes and their applications. And a vast majority of people who are, bear in mind, not our customers, did say they prefer to get all of the stack at once and they would like it to come from one source. Why do people care about moving every 4 months? Because they're getting a new feature in that new release. Perhaps one can expect as things stabilize and kind of the pace of change moderates, which is arguable, people would be interested in kind of a more nuanced approach where, hey, Ubuntu LTS is every 2 years, another vendor's LTS is, some other cadence. But if you could get aligned to those as the major releases, it would reduce the collective burden on keeping things up to date for longer, but also the teams which are migrating could have a more happier sleep, if I may say.
I think the key is predictability, whatever cadence anyone ends up going with, it just needs to be predictable for everyone. So we talked about the long-term aspect of long-term support. So let's talk about the support, right? So what is the framework that you use to determine the scope in terms of saying, okay, these CVs should be backported, but then this change is it just does not make sense to include in a extended support release. So how do you determine that? What's the framework that you use, or that you think should be used?
I'll go first. I think in our case, and I think this is going to be similar for a lot of organizations, is there, as we mentioned earlier, regulatory and compliance, right? So often that comes with security fixes. And so that's kind of the bare bones that we have to start with. But that also does pull in, as you alluded to, it's not just Kubernetes, right? There's like Jordan, our other chair on the working group, did a bunch of work in Kube to and worked with the Go team to get better support from long-term support from Go and get better compatibility across versions. That was a major pain because Go and Kubernetes release schedules aren't aligned. So I think it's kind of it can be probably according to the vendor, but I think in addition to security, it might be critical fixes, right? In our case, if there's a critical data flaw in say etcd or something, we would fix that. That's not something that we want to necessarily tolerate, but it's a sort of a case by case judgment based decision. That's what we found works best.
Yeah, I think similar for us. Our scoping initially and still is pretty much hardly aligned on security fixes and the things that come with it. Looking at features that people might want to bring back, that's not really in the scope of a traditional LTS. We're not maybe doing a traditional LTS, but I think that's a pretty hard line for us. Anything that we're going to take back that's even kind of looks like a feature has a lot more consideration around it, because it's going to complicate things. It's going to make the equation harder.
Right? Like if you're looking for a new feature, use the release that it comes with. You will actually have it for a longer lifetime. You shouldn't be looking to your point, there are cases where there may be exceptions, but in general.
Do you think backporting anything may cause a regression? Have you faced anything like that?
I think one of the really difficult parts of an LTS, kind of answering your question, is that yes, we're backporting known security issues for currently maintained versions, and say for dependencies as well, and we sort of determine what that closure of dependencies is. It might be only the things we offer, but I think one of the real difficulties is there's so much code that is just no longer maintained because it's been cut out of upstream. And so there's portions that just live in these old versions that we have to figure out and maintain and secure, right? So I think that's one of the real difficulties of this is, and also surfacing that to consumers to say, yes, you're getting this, and yes, we're doing our job to secure it, but you need to be aware of this.
I think another way of thinking about that question is, hey, Jordan, have we ever backported something that introduced a regression in supported Kubernetes releases? Only a dozen or so times in the last couple of years. Yeah, so in supported releases, it has happened. It's almost certainly going to happen at some point for unsupported releases for that exact reason. Like, this code is long gone, and we're making decisions about how to take something and retrofit it into that. I think it's not a if, it's going to happen at some point.
I think going back to your previous question, it kind of ties in on the period, because I think one of the success metric would be how quicker can you actually backport the fixes from an upstream to your supported LTS version, and how sustainable it is. I think that's one of the key driver to actually decide on the timeline.
Makes sense. And what you brought up about Go, right? So like Kubernetes doesn't really exist in isolation. So it is related to a bunch of, like a massive ecosystem of tools. So how do you do extended support for Kubernetes when the ecosystem is moving forward?
I think you start to maintain forks of those other projects as well. And it kind of comes down to analyzing what things are going to be that kind of minimum viable set of things to enable this functionality to exist. There are 209 projects or something like that in the CNCF right now. And if you decided to support all of those things for all, like, it'd be impossible, right? I think it's hard even with a concise set of add-ons or components that you're going to add into a cluster.
Yeah, there's like a real one example that just comes to mind is like there is forget the CVE ID. There's an issue in Core DNS, right? That was on a end of support version. The way that Core DNS fixed that CVE is that they added a new feature. Now, what do you do as a maintainer? Do you cut out the faulty code because maybe no one's using it? Do you actually add a new feature to patch a new feature into an old version of Core DNS? These are the real problems that you sort of have to address as you maintain an LTS.
Makes sense. I think at some point you need to draw the line and decide which other projects you want to support. Let's talk a little about upgrade paths. So eventually the end user will need to upgrade Kubernetes, even though they're on an extended support version. So what design decisions go in when you want to design upgrade paths for this?
So these are customers who are not going to upgrade frequently. So definitely some considerations have to be made compared to the standard upgrade. So how can we make it faster? Because they're not going to go through every intermediate version. So how to make it faster? So one way to look at it should be, I know the community is already investing into the skip upgrade, where you're actually going through skipping intermediate versions on the worker nodes. And for customers who actually work in a time-boxed windows, for them, the upgrade has to be split across multiple windows because it's time-boxed. But we also need to ensure that at the end of each window, the cluster is stable such that it can be used by the customer. So I think these two are some important things to look at in the upgrade design.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we moved to doing every version as well was really because of that upgrade path. If we pick one and then we say 4 releases later there's another LTS, what's the upgrade path look like? And it's probably going to involve trying to skip them, but maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. It's hard to know those things, and it's extra testing, it's extra work that you have to put in place for that. It's just extra risk, I think.
Testing, right? I think that was the other thing that I was going to touch base on is if you're supporting multiple versions, it just blows up the testing complexity. So what approach do you take here? Or what things do you need to keep in mind given that you're backporting security fixes and bugs?
Yeah, I think for us, we're just maintaining the tests for those older releases and running them. So it's extra infrastructure that we're paying for. It's extra cost in fixing them if they break or if there's a flake or something that we need to go back and handle. But it's I don't know, it's just kind of a necessary cost of it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I agree. I think on both those counts, right? Like it's easiest to say you go from n to n+1 to n+2 and so on. So it's important to keep that chain. Maybe the skip releases stuff. I think it's a bit early to say that. On the testing piece, as a distro of Kubernetes, we will rely heavily on the upstream provided tests, and then possibly have some particular things that we add on top, but we try to stay true to upstream, even if it's LTS.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then I'm going to keep some time for questions from the audience. So we've talked a lot about long-term, the support aspects, the testing upgrades. But in your opinion, what are some misconceptions around this whole topic? Like that, I think a lot of folks have opinions around this. But what do you think is like, people think it's straightforward, but it's really not?
I think one thing naturally is you just backport the patch, right? Yeah. Like who here has ever backported a patch that failed to patch, right? That's really, if it's code that you even are familiar with, that can be difficult. If it's code that you're not familiar with, then it just becomes extra difficult, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest difficulties. Like as we talked about earlier, things upstream change, things get cut out, things get added, new layers get introduced. And so having to port a patch to an older version, it's a real time commitment.
I think the assumption that it's super easy to upgrade Go as well is another one that people undersell.
Yeah, in most cases it is, except for when it's
not.
I think my last question is going to be around, I think, what everyone wants to hear. So maybe Jeremy can take this. Why is the LTS working group winding down, and what's the story?
Yeah, I think if you follow the channel at all, there's a lot of canceling this meeting because of lack of agenda. We have had lots of discussion, and we've had a lot of proposals that have come in for discussion, but there hasn't been a lot of action to come out of that. There hasn't been a lot of, here are the dedicated resources that are going to do this work. A lot of the proposals ended up just being, oh, we'll make this change in the upstream community. And the upstream community has tons of extra time to do things and tons of extra resources to pay for anything that might go along with that. Surely, right? The answer is no. So I think it's hard to build consensus around things. It's hard to get agreement on things, but it's also impossible to do things when there is no resource to do the things you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll add on to that and say, I think even when we try to make the sort of, or to even discuss like the most minimal, what we could think of as maybe the most minimal version of an upstream LTS, can we just, I think our latest proposal and discussion was, can we just maintain some patches in a folder that are sort of blessed? Well, going along with that, there's all kinds of work that's done by SIG Infra for testing. There's all kinds of work that's done by SIG Docs for documentation. And I think that there's probably a perception that all these big companies have like reams of people who can just throw at these problems, right? Well, maybe, but Kubernetes is not just made of large vendors who sell Kubernetes, right? There's lots of people who are involved in the project who don't work at a large vendor, and so asking them to take on additional work is not something that is not something that I think is probably just even in the best interest necessarily of the community. I think we have at this point something that, like any open source project, nothing's ever perfect, right? Like it's a lot of volunteer time, and even for the people who do work at vendors, right? Like they're spending. If you're at a conference like this, you're away from your family, you're away from your home, even if it's for work, especially if it's not for work. That's a big commitment. So I think that's probably one of the other inputs for people to think about.
That's a good point. So you want to go?
Oh yeah, I was just saying that while the need is undeniable, I think before even like in parallel to the group, I think the vendors, they've gone ahead and addressed this through their product offerings commercially. So I think that's one of the other reason I feel there's some amount of least interest, I would say, probably.
Yeah, this isn't the first time that this happens in an open source project, right? There's precedents with many others, and there's almost a fork in the road where either the big vendors pitch in to keep it going, dollars, people, whatever, or the logical alternative is then that the vendors who care kind of end up owning that responsibility on their side. And I'm sure, there'll be a way forward.
So do you think overall, like I know in the past we used to have the working group, then it was sunset, and then it got spin up again. Do you think there'll ever be a time we'll again spin up the working group?
Never say never.
Yeah, my personal opinion maybe is just that I think that there's a market need, right, for long-term support. Businesses have this need, and I think previously that really wasn't filled, right, before in the past incarnation of the LTS. And I think at this point, like as we said, there's commercial opportunities for that need, and so it could come up again. But I think that in the current form, things have sort of seemed to reach an equilibrium. So we'll see if something disrupts Kubernetes. Who knows?
Really leave it at that. So I guess never say never. So yeah, thank you everyone. I think I hope this panel gave some insight into where we are with LTS in the community. And I think like how Micah pointed out, the equilibrium that we've reached around how we are addressing this as an ecosystem across different companies, but also what are the common patterns that we can take back to our own team. So